morning, everyone. I am Rachel Corbett, host of Google's Rethink podcast, as well as a few other things. And I want to welcome you to the very first episode of our three-part series, On the Line. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be exploring what commerce looks like in 2021 and where it is heading in the future. In this episode, there's been a once-in-a-generation shift. We'll see how last year's mass adoption of digital technology across the world changed consumer behaviour and consumer expectation forever. We've got some fantastic guests on the way, as well as insights that you can't get anywhere else. And hopefully, by the end of the session, you'll be thinking very differently about your approach to commerce. So let's kick it off with a little reminiscing about 2020. The year that none of us thought we'd be having. And some of us in recent lockdowns, the year that feels like it's really still going. During 2020, when our lives were totally upended by COVID and we found ourselves at home a lot more than we ever expected, there was unsurprisingly a massive shift to digital, which I'm about to prove with some stats. 1.3 million Aussies bought online for the very first time, which included 50.7% year-on-year growth in regional and remote Australia. In New Zealand, over 300,000 Kiwis made an online purchase for the very first time, and Australians are spending 17% more time online than they did in 2019, which is an average of 21 hours per week. That's just over 1.5 months of the year. So naturally, with such a huge swing to online, businesses have had to adapt, which is why they've done things like curbside pickup, contactless delivery. Some of us were even on first-name basis with our delivery drivers. I'm talking about you, John, from Dan Murphy's. And the modern consumer's behaviour is getting harder and harder to predict. If they're anything like me, they'll see a pair of boots in a shop window, they'll pull out their phone to check if they're online, they'll Google something totally different, then they'll wind up coming home 2 hours later with a haircut, 2 sets of steak knives, and absolutely no recollection of ever wanting boots in the first place. It is a really wild ride. Consumers are using multiple digital and physical channels on their winding path to purchase, and brands who are still thinking about online and offline separately could be left behind. So this morning, we're going to get stuck into the evidence of this permanent shift in consumer behaviour and also see why brands need to be thinking past the imaginary division of online versus offline. Later, we'll be speaking with Dr. Morten, Managing Director of research company GfK, to see what a recent and very detailed consumer study uncovered. But first, I'd like to introduce you to our resident commerce expert. She brings with her an extensive track record of technology and business innovation leadership and is currently Google's Director of Commerce for Australia and New Zealand. Welcome, Renee Gamble.
Thanks. Great to be with you, Rachel. Welcome to my home.
Thanks for joining us in your house. I feel like we're all getting very familiar with each other's living arrangements these days. Now, I've been speaking a lot about how consumer behaviour has changed. Do you think that there are any buying habits that are just never going to be the same again?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And you'd know this just intuitively yourself as a consumer. I mean, we were all shopping and we're all shopping online. And I think last year, there was this massive influx of people who were shopping online for the first time. And frankly, a lot of these people would have shopped online because they had to. They've never really had to shop online before. Even if I share just a personal example, last year, both my oven and my dishwasher completely died within a week of each other. And normally, for such really big ticket purchases, I would have only felt comfortable going into store to have a conversation with a real person and to have that more tactile touch and feel experience. But just, I guess, kind of out of an abundance of caution and just not really being able to go into store, I had to go online. I had some great customer service online with real people chatting to me through the experience, but I really struggled to be able to get a stock that was going to be available to help me out in my time of need. In the end, I went to a whole new retailer I'd never purchased from before, appliances online, and I bought both of those really big ticket items in one massive transaction, and they were delivered and installed in my house within the week. And so it was a brand new relationship I would never have normally had. And I think overall our comfort levels with being online and e-commerce have really lifted, and we're really blending much more of those online and offline experiences. And I think this change really will stick, this ongoing fluidity. It's a new way that we shop.
Let's talk a bit about that continuous connection, because obviously the omni-channel experience for some brands is something that they really are focusing on. The number of companies that invested in it jumped from 20 to 80%. So there are a lot of them that are really understand the importance of it. But in terms of that continuous connection, if brands want to build that with their customers, what does that actually involve?
Well, firstly, it means showing up. You need to recognise that your consumers are online, your customers are online, and so you need to show up. And if you don't, someone else will, and they'll capture their attention and they'll provide them with the information that they're looking for. It's also recognising that you need to build that kind of continuous thread, if you like, in terms of the experience, so that the experience that you show a customer when they are online carries through in a really continuous and seamless way to the physical store experience, so that you show up as a brand really in a very consistent manner, both online and offline. And also recognise that just because you advertise online doesn't mean that your customer will buy online. In fact, a lot of online channels such as search, display, digital video have a massive impact in your in-store sales. It can actually drive 42% of in-store traffic. And on the other hand, offline channels like your physical stores, those experience can drive a big uplift in your online traffic, 40% in fact. So to really bring it to life, you need to connect and bridge the transitions between the touch points. And that can sometimes involve resolving some tension that can happen between the innovation that might be happening in this fast-growing online space that you're operating in, and then the consistency that you want your customer to experience when they go into your physical stores. And resolving those tensions and thinking end to end is really critical around kind of future-proofing your business and thinking about the strategy for the long term.
There are so many brands that have had to step up during COVID to address changes in behaviour. But do you think some of those behaviours that they're addressing are here to stay?
Absolutely. And we've been able to, I guess it's hard to predict the future, but I guess we're going to explore a bit of that here today and through this series. But when we just look at some of the data that we've got available, so 70% of Aussie households shopped online during the first quarter of this calendar year, which was an increase of 12% year on year. And at that time, it was despite fewer lockdowns and a lot more mobility and freedom across the country. And similarly, in New Zealand, online shoppers, they were about 2.16 million between January and March this year, which was 135,000 more than the year before. And so I think what these numbers tell us, or what they show us, is that the expectation really has advanced. There are more consumers online, and they expect brands to meet them wherever they are on their journey and really to connect with them and interact with them online and offline.
Definitely. I certainly know that in my experience, I did a lot more online shopping out of necessity. And then all of a sudden I thought to myself, why have I not been doing this always? This is really convenient. So then when life goes back to normal, you're like, I'm going to get people to bring things to my house rather than go out. Well, thank you so much, Renee. Really appreciate your time and your insights.
Thanks.
Well, it's pretty clear that for all of us, the idea of switching between online and offline feels like something we don't even think about. And if marketers aren't taking that into account when they're thinking about the customer experience, then they're going to miss out. Renee, we'll see you again in our third episode of Rethinking the Line to chat through some of these realities in much more detail. But my next guest on the line is Managing Director of research company GfK, who, in partnership with Google, recently completed an incredibly in-depth study into changing consumer behaviour and why the continuous connection approach is so important for brands. He's a self-described ageing metalhead and also manages a research company. Dr. Morten.
Hi, Rachel. Nice to meet you.
Now, before we get into the research, I have a very important question to ask you. Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, or Metallica, and why?
Oh, that's the easiest question you're going to ask me, Rachel, I think. So it's Metallica, of course. Why? Morbid lyrics, jarringly distorted guitars, pulverizing drums, sweaty, antisocial fans. What's there not to love?
Oh, gee. I'll tell you what, with a description like that, you might convert me to metal, Morten.
Yeah, it sounds enticing, doesn't it?
Well, now that we've got all of the important things out of the way, talk us through the research you conducted and what was involved.
When you lock down entire countries and shut most physical stores, it's going to have an impact on commerce and consumer behaviour. So we wanted to explore that. In market research, we tend to look at quantitative methodologies or qualitative methodologies. Sometimes we'll even use both. But for this study, we actually had 4 different types of quant, 3 different types of qual, a really comprehensive literature review. And we also measured passively people's online behaviour for 8,000 days. And we did this across 4 different product categories. So in many ways, it was a research geek's dream of a project.
And with all of that information, what were the sort of things that surprised you most out of those findings?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at any relationship that you've got in your life with your family, friends and colleagues, these rely on continuous connection. But during COVID, face-to-face was completely removed as an option for a time there. So for instance, if you look at work and what a lot of us had to go through at work, we had to really rethink how we are going to get the most out of interacting remotely and then blend that together with being back in the office slowly and in person. And so that kind of impact on relationships and interaction, we've also saw in the data play out with consumers and the way they interact with brands and retailers. So there's been new habits formed and new expectations to go along with it. We saw that over half of Australians in our study were saying that they're doing more interaction online now than they were pre-COVID. And that means they're learning about what works for them and what doesn't work for them. So they might be shopping for groceries more online, but at the same time, they've also learned that they actually still prefer when they can to go in store to pick out the fresh produce. So, they get more discerning with how they use online and how they use that to blend with their offline interactions as well. And it's really the brands and the retailers who get that intertwining between online and offline engagement right that are going to win and be rewarded. People in our study said that they feel 52% more positive about brands that connect with them through both online and offline means rather than just using one realm. Why don't we look at someone that we observed who was in the market for new car insurance. So you can imagine yourself, if you were in the market for car insurance, you might start that journey online. And so this person that we saw actually took a very non-linear path to getting to that car insurance. We saw them Google car trouble and then spare parts. So they obviously were having an issue with their existing car. It looks like it didn't turn out that well. The prognosis wasn't great because a day later they were around looking for new cars. We saw them Google things like 7-seater cars, and they were having a look at reviews and brand pages and aggregator sites and comparing prices and dealerships and things like that. So then they came back a few days later and they got even more specific. So they had a bit of a chance to digest all that information. And now they were much clearer on exactly what they were looking for. They had the brand, they had the model in mind, they had the year in mind. And then they started looking at detailed reviews specifically to do with that particular model of car. They looked at more dealerships as well. They even did a car history check, which is exactly the sort of pattern most people would follow if they were in the market for a new car. A couple of days later, we see that they're doing more price comparisons. They broaden their search now to go back to the aggregators and dealerships. They're getting close now. And as we get closer to buying cars and insurance, we start looking at things like financing and comparing quotes from different insurers. We saw this person also actually make a phone call to get an insurance quote as well before they went back online again a few days later. Then they looked at more insurance options and more financing options before finally they settled on a car insurer and they transacted online. So I think it shows the complexity, how non-linear these journeys are, and also the fact that people really need some steering and navigation to help them move through that complex journey, how online and offline each play a role, how they are intertwined, and how important as well it is for people to be able to rely on a trusted navigator to sort of steer them through that omni-channel journey. So it's not surprising that we saw 70% of consumer journeys, including a Google touchpoint such as search, YouTube, and maps in the data.
What about the changing role of the store? What did you find from your research, and sort of what are your thoughts on what the future of that will be?
So look, if we go back to the earlier point about how people really appreciate when brands and retailers get that omni-channel engagement right, so they can interact with you both online and offline. the expectation really is for that to happen. So it's about how you integrate the two. If, you're a consumer and, you're in the market for a TV, you could easily go online because the experience there is such that it's very easy to access information, independent reviews, even consumer reviews. If you log in with your details, you can even get personalized recommendations and maybe offers. But if you walk into a store, it's not the same experience for many people. So you've got maybe a restricted range. You're a bit more anonymous. You're a bit more alone in your decision-making process, and maybe not as trusting of the advice that you might receive if you do go and speak to someone, one of the assistants. So that gap, I think, between the online experience and the in-store experience is going to become increasingly less acceptable to people. So we saw 1 in 3 people telling us that they had at least one brand interaction which didn't meet their expectations and needs. And we've seen that percentage even higher in some overseas studies as well.
That's really important to get right if you want people to turn up and then to keep coming back. So what would your kind of final takeaways around this be?
First of all, clearly COVID brought more people online, not only just to transact, but also as a mode of engagement before and after purchasing. So as a result, people were learning what works best for them. They became more discerning about where and how they want to engage online, and they expect brands to understand that. Secondly, just like any relationship, as I mentioned, the interactions people have online and offline, they combine to create an overall perception of a brand or a retailer. So online and offline touch points, they overlap, they influence one another. So the experiences you have online can bring you into the store and vice versa. Those who integrate the advantages of both, rather than treating them separately, are the companies that are going to win. And with all that complexity, our data showed that Google does play a key role in steering consumers between the many different touch points. The third thing and final thing I'd say is that even though effective omnichannel engagement presents a lot of great new opportunities, it's also reshaping expectations. So there's going to be a lower tolerance for getting it wrong. So as is the case with anything that's innovative, the people who do it best are the ones who are going to create the new benchmark for others to follow.
Morten, thank you so much for your time and your insights. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks so much, Rachel.
It's so interesting to see just how far-reaching the impacts of COVID have been in terms of changing our behaviour. And that is all we have time for today. Short but sweet. Hopefully today's conversation has really got you thinking about how to better connect your online and offline experiences so you can successfully respond to the totally unexpected once-in-a-generation shift in consumer behaviour that we have seen thanks to COVID. Next week, our theme is navigating normal, and we'll be exploring what brands need to do to stay agile in a competitive and fluid environment, both from a marketing and a whole of business perspective. For that, we'll be speaking to Professor Lee Waters about how positive psychology can help businesses be their best, as well as hearing from fashion retailer The Iconic about how their marketing mindset has changed in the past 12 to 18 months. Until then, stay safe, and I'll see you on the line next week.